I think there's a very famous statistic that people, when they leave a business, tend not to leave the business, but they tend to leave the manager. If you're like me, you're quite an impulsive person. So, I'm the guy that goes into Aldi and goes in for my bread and my milk and comes out with an angle grinder. So what you tend to find is that EQ develops, it comes to its sort of higher levels, sort of in the 20s and then through to our sort of mid-40s to 50s, where it actually peaks for most people, and then it will start to actually drop away.
Hello and welcome to the VFM Podcast. I'm here today with Mark Grimshaw and we're going to be talking about emotional intelligence. So Mark, emotional intelligence, well my first question actually is, you refer to this as EQ. So are they the same things? And if it is, what does EQ stand for?
Okay, I think that's a very good question to start with. I think obviously emotional intelligence is something that most people have heard about. The term EQ is just basically emotional quotient, so it really describes the fact that we're discussing emotional intelligence. Right. I think most people probably understand the idea of IQ. That's probably something that we were taught at school, and everybody's a little fearful of. But the expression EQ or emotional intelligence is probably something that's less well recognised.
Okay, so is emotional intelligence something that can be measured then?
Yes, I mean just like you could do an IQ test. You can go online, you can answer some questions, and it will give you a score on your IQ. You can do the same again with an EQ test. There are various different levels of accuracy with that, I would say, but there are some very well recognised tests that you can do, and it can give you quite a good idea of actually where your EQ standards are.
Okay, I might try one of them later then. But,
good idea.
I think probably the first, let's look into, so what is emotional intelligence very briefly? Can you give us an overview of what it is?
Yeah, so once again, I would say very often when we're running courses on this sort of thing, I'll ask that question of the students, and it's quite interesting.
Should I answer what I think?
Yeah, go on.
In my head, it's sort of empathy, and probably I'd say being aware of my own emotions.
Okay.
So that's what I would go for.
Yeah,
That is how accurate that is.
Good. Actually, I think you're spot on. The first, maybe your first response there is the usual response that I would get, which is, it's empathy. It's how well am I tuned into other people, and how well do I understand other people. But the second piece that you mentioned there, which was about your awareness of yourself, actually is really the crux of EQ, is the ability to understand yourself, your own emotions, and so on.
Yeah. Okay. And this, we talk about in a business context. Is it, you can see how this would be important in, I suppose, personal relationships, but in a business environment, how does this come into play?
It's critical, and I think if you look at the criteria that would be measured in an EQ assessment, there are really five areas. So that would be things like self-perception, for example. Right. So how do you see yourself? And I'm sure you've met people in your life who perhaps have a rather inflated view of themselves. And by the same token, and probably a little bit more frequently, you'd see people who have perhaps a slightly lower level of perception of themselves. There might be things around expression. So it might be, how do we actually communicate with each other? Are we assertive? Are we passive? Or maybe in some cases, are we aggressive?
Right.
Okay. Another area you'd be measured against would be interpersonal skills. So how good are you at building relationships, improving relationships? And of course, that's where your empathy comes in, maybe even adjusting your communication style to suit the person that you're talking to. A fourth one would be decision making. So this would be, if you're like me, you're quite an impulsive person. So, I'm the guy that goes into Aldi and goes in for my bread and my milk and comes out with an angle grinder. I'm a bit impulsive.
Yeah.
So, decision making is an important part of this, how you make decisions, how you problem solve. And probably the last one, which is really important and influences the others, would be your management of stress, or how you tolerate stress.
Right. Okay.
Because clearly, if we're thinking in a stressed manner, if we're thinking with our emotional brain and we don't control that, then of course that can affect our relationship. So back to your original question, how does it influence us? You can probably see in lots of different ways in our business.
Okay. So we talked about measuring it. Is there something, for example, you can measure someone's EQ and say, well, actually, you've done very poorly? Is that something we'd say, or is it just you're just different? Is this something you say there's a good score and a bad score?
Right. Okay. Again, really good question. And I think if you're going to do an EQ assessment, it's not necessarily about having a really high score across the whole category. It's actually much more about how those particular scores in those 5 areas are actually interrelated.
Okay.
So, to give you an example, let me think of an example. Let's say, for example, that you have a high level of optimism. That's an element of EQ, to be optimistic. And in sales, you have to have a high level of optimism. But let's just say your score in optimism was very high. Let's say that your score in impulse control, like me, was probably quite low.
Okay.
And perhaps your score in reality testing was also low.
Right, yeah.
Can you see in that situation, high positivity, low impulse control is probably going to mean that I'm going to take a lot of risks.
Yes.
So it's not so much about where the score are, it's how the scores interrelate.
Right, okay. Categories. Yeah. No, I can see that. I can see, if you were very sort of highly impulsive and optimistic, you may be naive in business decisions, maybe just seeing everything as wonderful and missing actually there's a big problem here. It's interesting you talk about optimism. I think I'm quite pessimistic, but I think that's quite good in a way because it sort of makes you stop and think about things before you do it. And but I'm aware that it's sometimes maybe you look a bit down on stuff and you need someone else to be optimistic to kind of pull you back together and say, oh, actually, it's not too bad.
Yes, and I think it's a really good point. I mean, all of these things are useful in their right level. But I think, if they get out of control or they're maybe too low in certain circumstances, then that will influence the way we approach something. Like we say, being overtly optimistic can be quite dangerous.
Yeah. Now, I can see like sort of very obvious scenario where someone might think, you probably think about this with someone else, this person needs EQ training because they're ignorant or they're aggressive or, they're coming in their bad mood and it affects absolutely everyone else. So I can see that might be, you've got a specific problem maybe with a certain individual and you think, he or she, they need this training because I'm going to put them on that. But let's say there's not one particular individual or a specific problem. Is it beneficial generally to be more aware of this? Just in let's say a perfectly well-functioning team, is it something that we should all be introduced to, or is it just for the problem cases?
Oh no, absolutely. It's something I think that we should all be aware of. Yeah. And actually, I think a lot of people will probably tell you that they are more emotionally intelligent than they actually are. In fact, if you just look at the one area of self-perception and maybe emotional awareness, it's estimated that only, I think it's 35% of people are actually aware of their own emotions at any point and how those emotions can be influencing others. And if you think just about normal situations, even in the office environment, or perhaps when you come in from a tough day at work, and what we might do is, we kind of bring that emotion into the house. We've had a stressful day, things are on top of us, and we come into a household environment and probably, we're not even aware of it, but we bring in a little bit of stress with us. We're a bit maybe, upset, and we maybe growl at people and so on. And actually, when we think about how we influence other people, it's a fascinating piece of science. We actually only influence people either 100% positively or 100% negatively.
Really?
There's nothing in between. So, we have a choice as to whether we can actually spin up positive cycles of emotion or spin down negative cycles of emotion. Okay. So it means just being aware of that situation. Yeah.
And are there ways to, I suppose, improve your score, or say I'm aware that, I come in and I'm now aware that I'm in a bad mood. Like, are there ways we can take to sort of positively change that so that, I suppose talking about business environment in particular to improve the business, are there sort of any tips or tricks you've got? Maybe, how do you sort of put a smile on? Maybe that's the question. I don't know.
Yeah. Sometimes you have to force it on.
Yeah.
But I think that even forcing a smile on, I think having the awareness that you need to do that, I think it demonstrates a certain degree of emotional intelligence in the first place. But in a fascinating manner, if you do actually manipulate your own behavior and maybe even your body language, what you will actually do is stimulate other parts of the brain that will influence the way that you're actually feeling. So you can, you can actually assist your own emotions by consciously adjusting them.
Yeah, I think someone told me once, if you force a smile, you find actually you do feel a bit better because it releases something, even though you want to shout or whatever. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. Obviously there's an advantage there. If people in the business are happier, the business is going to be, it's going to be a nicer place to work for everyone. I think that's probably quite important just on its own. But are there sort of commercial advantages as well to having a good understanding of emotional intelligence within your team?
Without a doubt. I mean, again, I think if you look at different job functions, there would be different levels of that. So, if you take, we talked about salespeople, for example, and the importance of optimism. If you're aware and you can manage your optimism, then you might be out on a territory and you might be driving past a client and you look down the drive and you think, maybe it's not worth going down there.
Yeah.
The pessimism creeps in, and that will adjust your behaviour, and hence you'll drive past and you won't actually go down the drive. Resilience might be another thing. You see, for example, some salespeople are on a high when they're selling stuff. They lose a deal, and you'll find for several days or even weeks afterwards they struggle to have the confidence to go back down another drive. If you look at management, you think about it. Think about how you're influencing other people in terms of motivation.
Yeah.
So if I don't have a certain degree of empathy, it's very unlikely that I'm going to be able to find the motivational triggers of my people and then adjust my communication, for example, to suit that motivation. If we think about just the spirit and the employee satisfaction in an environment, I think there's a very famous statistic that people, when they leave a business, tend not to leave the business, but they tend to leave the manager.
Right.
Something like 75% of people that leave will actually leave as a result of their relationship or their levels of respect for the manager. And of course, most of that is driven by EQ.
Yeah.
So it can have a big effect.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What would be, say, I want to sort of improve EQ within my organisation. What are the first steps I take? Is it one of these online tests, or do I pay for someone to come in, or what's the first way to do it?
Right. Well, I would say if I want to improve it in my organisation, as you pitched it there, if I was a leader or manager, then I would say to start practicing it.
Yeah.
So be aware of it yourself, because you'll find, like we said about spinning up different emotions and behaviours. If you really focus it on yourself, you'll find that naturally you'll get some improvement in the way other people are relating with you and others.
Yes.
I think the next thing would be to open up some context around the subject. So don't just throw assessments at people. That can be somewhat spooky if you don't understand what's going on.
It's a very bad emotional intelligence thing. You come in, right, we're all doing this test, do it now.
Exactly.
Of course, by lunchtime.
Yeah, exactly. So I think you'd have to provide some context around it, and we can talk about, as we've just said, the impact on performance, the impact on employee satisfaction, impact on customer relationships.
Yeah.
So putting a bit of context to it, and then creating a bit of interest. I would say, and most people are interested in it when you give that context, and then maybe do an assessment or with your team and create an open discussion about it, because I think as soon as you start to talk about it, people start thinking about it.
Yeah. Is there ever resistance to this, have you found? Or is it people tend to, I would imagine most people would be open, but I can also, have you come across people who just say no?
Yes, absolutely. And funnily enough, it comes back to their emotional intelligence. So you might find somebody, for example, who has a very high level of self-regard, a very unrealistic level of high self-regard. And of course, to them, they would already see themselves as being emotionally intelligent and refuse to accept that they would need to do assessment. So, I think there are some people who, maybe aren't open to it.
Yeah,
I would think. And maybe even, we didn't mention it, but when we talk about EQ, it is different to IQ in terms of when you develop it in your life,
right,
and also when it fades in your life. So what you tend to find is that EQ develops, it comes to its sort of higher levels, sort of in the 20s, and then through to our sort of mid 40s to 50s, where it actually peaks. For most people, and then it will start to actually drop away. So if you look at a teenager, you've got all this to come. Or in fact, maybe closer for you would be a 4-year-old. They're not going to show any empathy. When they're hungry, they're going to scream. But you'll see similar behaviours, strangely, when somebody becomes a lot older. Those of you who've got elderly relatives will notice that their emotional intelligence starts to drop away a little bit. So they are different.
Yeah, maybe they just don't care what anyone else thinks anymore.
Yes, well, exactly. Yeah, maybe, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mark. We're running out of time. So, very briefly, I suppose if someone is keen on learning more about this, I don't think, do we actually do a course on EQ?
We do courses on EQ, but we also include EQ, of course, on a lot of our courses, like leadership and sales techniques. But obviously, as always, if anybody is interested in the subject, then we're very happy to talk to them about it.
Yeah. Is it something that would be a coaching thing, or is it more sort of broader than that?
Yes, it can also come into coaching, individual coaching. So, and let's be honest, it's quite personal.
Yes.
So in certain circumstances, people might be having challenges not because of competency, but actually because of their emotional intelligence.
Okay, wonderful. Mark, thank you very much, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.